In 2022, there was a book published that really kind of spooked a lot in America. It was by Stephen Marche. It was called The Next Civil War. And as people discovered when they read the book, that there was lots of details in there that made it seem like, something that we thought was buried deep in the past, in 1863. That's just nothing that would happen in the modern age. We may have some disagreements here and there, but certainly nothing like a civil war. But this author, Stephen Marche, said, no, actually, it's a lot bigger of a risk than you may think. And in fact, if you don't really understand what the risk is, we may unwittingly drift into it. And I found the book excellent and also very disturbing because it was so saturated with evidence and factual information that his projections carried a lot of weight. And so I've been trying to get him for a long time. Finally, have gotten Stephen Marche to be able to join us here today, and we are privileged to get to have the author of the book with us. And so, Stephen, first of all, just welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Pleasure to be with you. Yeah, always nice to be with you.
Well, listen, I just want to ask you before we get started, what led you to writing this book? How did you stumble upon this idea and turn it into a book?
Well, a Canadian magazine sent me down to cover the 2016 inauguration, the first Trump inauguration, and it had, I'm not a conflict reporter, right? Like I am a journalist, but I'm not the guy they send to Haiti or whatever, like or Ukraine. And so I was at this event, and suddenly, I'm standing on top of a limousine and it's on fire. Suddenly, I'm in a group of like pretty radical anarchists in complete black masks, and then I go for a cigarette, and they come back and they're all arrested and charged with felonies, it turns out. And there just was a kind of incredible hostility and fall of Rome vibe. And so I decided, okay, the political discourse that I hear doesn't explain anything, right? Like it always gets it wrong. Certainly it got it wrong before 2016. I'm going to try and go across America, and I'm going to interview everyone that I can, and I'm going to find the most reliable information I can and the best available models that I can, and figure out what is going on in the United States. And the result is this book.
And did it surprise you from your first thought when you were talking about all the things you observed at the inauguration, and when you started going around the country, did what you discover surprise you, or did you find it what you expected?
Oh, I mean, well, I mean, kind of both. No, I would say it was very surprising. I mean, I'm almost 50 now, so I grew up until I was 30, assuming that America was not just a stable country, but the stable country. Like it was like I come from Canada. We nearly fell apart twice in my childhood, and America was like absolute icon of stability during that period. And of course, the past 20 years, we've seen that America is actually incredibly unstable, and that the interior kind of contradictions of its political situation are starting to rear their heads. So I that's still surprising to me. Like that's still like how that happened is very, very strange to me, and it seems to me a very pressing intellectual question. When I crossed America, because I look the way that I do, and because I come from Alberta, which is sort of the Texas of Canada, I was welcomed into a lot of far right places, and certainly spoke with them and got along very well with them and liked them, and that was surprising. I think when I came to understand the models that this book is really based on, suddenly a lot of things were a lot less surprising to me, if you will.
I see. Yeah, and that's part of the concern, that things start to make a little more sense.
Yeah,
And let's
exactly.
actually just jump right into the introduction, because the first couple of sentences of the book really get your attention. Gary, if you can throw that first one up there, because what you write is, the United States is coming to an end. The first sentence of the book. The question is how. Every government, every business, every person alive will be affected by the answer. And then you go on to say that the United States was synonymous with its glory of democracy. No longer. Solidarity has dissolved. Not is dissolving, I noticed, but it has, past tense, dissolved. The American system has become a case study of paralysis. Political violence is on the rise. So what leads you to write that first sentence there, is coming to an end, not that it's in danger of going downhill?
Well, the United States is a textbook case of a country headed for civil war. In every other instance in history where the conditions that you find in the United States exist, civil war arises. That includes the levels of inequality, both horizontal and vertical inequality, that there fundamentally is no political solution to, and therefore tends to lead to violence. You have the hyperpartisanship by geographical region, which I think we can say is pretty definite at this point. I mean, when I started writing this stuff in 2018, it might have been a little vaguer, but I think it's pretty evident to everyone now that that's a real phenomenon. As well as the environmental degradation, which the CAA calls a threat multiplier. Like, there's a lot of threat multipliers operating in American life right now. And then you get the real key one. I mean, there are a couple of key ones, but one of them is that America in 2040 is going to become a majority minority country, i.e., less than 50% of the country will be white. And wherever that happens in the world, like in Africa and South America and Europe, anywhere that happens, violence precedes that event. And also just the decline in the trust in institutions, which is kind of the mega trend that you can see in this book, and that you can see when you really do a hard look on the data, where it's not just trust in Congress, and it's not just trust in the Senate, it's trust in media, it's trust in the church, it's trust in every kind of institution that makes up what you call society. So, as I say at the end of the book, like, nothing is written in stone. Like, and I'm not a futurist. Like, I don't give dates, and I'm not making predictions per se. I'm making projections from the models that I have seen, which I consider the best available models. And I also don't see anyone trying to stop the onset of the effects of what is happening. So that's why I wrote that opening line of the book.
And so, what has your research shown is the reason for this deterioration? I'm not a young
Mhm.
chicken anymore myself, so I mean, I remember
Yeah,
growing up in the 80s and 90s, and even into my professional life at the beginning in the early 2000s. That, yeah, I mean, this, like you said, obviously the United States is the beacon of global stability. I mean, if anything's going to fall
yeah,
apart, it certainly isn't going to be the United States. And there was still, at that time, even in the 90s, still very high trust, like in the
yeah,
military and the clergy and even the
yeah.
government. Maybe Congress was starting to go down, but still, it was still relatively high. What caused the deterioration from that time forward, say, until today?
Well, just to be clear, this is my interpretation. So this is not from the experts that I spoke to. But the experts that I spoke to, like, whenever I asked them when did it really start to go haywire, the answer was, and this is everyone, like the experts on environmental, the experts on the experts on civil war from Prio in Norway, the experts on extremism, the rise of extremism, all of these things. They all mentioned 2008. Like, and just to
Hmm.
be clear, they're reading that on a chart, so they're not making implications about what did that. Like, so it's 2008, and then everything just goes funk like that,
Wow.
and their charts, right? Um, what happened in 2008? I mean, the biggest one, the one that if you really beg them to give you a kind of answer, would be the housing crisis, right? Where after the housing crisis, you start to see really the death of the middle class American dream, right? Where the basic premise of America is that your children will do better than you, materially and therefore in other ways. And when that starts to fall apart, I mean, there are other things that happen. Some people would say that having a black president, through the culture into some kind of shock. Also, you could say the surge in Iraq, which was that same year, and
Yeah.
and the failure there. Right, there are other things that are doing it, but 2008. I mean, to me, 2008 is clearly the turning point, right? And what you see in that, there's no causality. Like, what I try to do in this book, because American politics is so filled with just constant theories and constant explanations that really come out of nothing. I really try to make everything only what I can establish, right? Like, only what I feel, and to the point where I can tell the reader the value of the model, right? So economic models are worth practically nothing. I put those in the book too, but I explained these models are really worth very little. The environmental models have an unbelievable track record. I put that in the book too, right? So what were the models come out of 2008? That's when things start to really go crazy. right. And you could say that, the decline in trust in institutions begins earlier. It tends to begin in 1980, and it's very slow. That's a very slow process. What caused that? Um, that's like a spiritual question. Like, I don't think there's a I don't think I'm competent to give an answer to why there was this decline in trust in institutions. I think that is a broad, this book would never purport to give an answer to that. That's like a question of what happened in the American consciousness, and I don't know what happened there.
It's perhaps not uncoincidentally around that same time also that you had the rise of a lot of social media, which put a lot of these platforms out there and gave an opportunity for people to share their views and complain and whatnot else. I mean,
Yeah.
does your research show anything about that?
Well, I wanted I wanted to have a whole chapter on social media, right? Like, I had this whole thing planned out. And then I showed it to a friend, and he was like, "Well, all the same stuff happened in Germany, and it didn't happen. The same stuff didn't happen to them. And Canada has way more social media engagement than the United States, but it didn't happen with us either." And so, there's no question that social media affected this stuff, and obviously, one of the things that we're dealing with is this incredibly polluted information environment that we happen to live in, right? Where any kind of basis of solidarity is mostly impossible because no one can agree on even the most basic facts, right? um, Social media contributed to that, but again, as I said, I only like to have things in this book that I can really demonstrate, right? Here is, and it's not really possible to do that with social media. I mean, I think it is really the way that social media interacts with, you know, the most beautiful thing about America, which is its ability to generate new ideas, and its ability its freedom of thought, and its freedom of speech, and its freedom to, literally define your life on your own terms. When it seems to me somehow that the way that beautiful thing about America, the most beautiful thing about it, when it interacts with social media, it just has a much more, it just has a kind of toxic effect. But again, that's not in the book because I can't really establish that. That's just a supposition.
So it could be that it's almost an enabler, if not a causality issue,
Exactly.
that it
Yeah.
was a carrier for these other deeper trends, I guess. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, the CIA uses the phrase threat multiplier, and I really like that phrase because it's not exactly a threat, and it's not exactly like, you can't put a causality to it. It increases the chances of violence. It increases the chances of breakdown. It's sort of like smoking. Like, some people smoke their whole lives and nothing bad happens to them. Other people get lung cancer, right? But
Yeah.
there's a percentage of it, right? That's how I think of the social media dimension of it. Although, obviously, information pollution, I mean, I do deal with that in the book, right? Like mimetic warfare and the whole trend of using misinformation as a tactic and so on. That is much more, that is something that I think you have to face as part of the reality that is bringing up the chaos we're in.
I got it. Well, let's get into a little bit more about what a civil war would look like in the modern era. Now, I think you point out
Yeah.
in the book several places this is not going to be like the North and South with armies marching in different directions and whatever. But you say, and this is a call out here from the book. It says the collapse will arrive sooner and more suddenly than anybody expects, but it won't come as a surprise. America is cracking apart at a moment when the ability to see the cracks spreading has attained unprecedented clarity. I wonder if you can talk about that part first, because that almost seems counterintuitive. Because if it's so obvious, then why can't we all see it? But you say it won't come as a surprise, but it will shock people. How does that all fit together?
But I have to say, I'm pretty proud of that line. That's a pretty. I think I got that one just right. I mean, I think, I haven't seen that one in a while. I mean, I think we can see what I meant by that line was actually that the modeling available is so strong now, right? If you want to know what happens when a hurricane hits New York, you can talk to the researchers at Columbia, and they can show you to the street level, like, what will happen when a hurricane hits New York. The models for lone wolf terrorism, their accuracy is shocking, right? Like, to me anyway. They always, they of course are professionals, so it's no surprise to them. But to me, like if you want to see what how it happens, you absolutely can get a very in-depth look just by talking to the expert class. Um, what I mean, what it'll shock everyone, but it won't be surprising, is because people um, don't know what violence is and what civil war is like, and it's unbelievably brutal and unbelievably, it's the worst thing that can happen to a country. I think being occupied is actually better. And I think it is a state of fear and a state of instability that is truly drastic. I mean, I remember one of the first interviews I ever did for this book was with an American network, and one of the guys asked me. He said, "Do you think a civil war would be that bad an idea? Do you think it would clear the air?" And I was like, "Are you kidding? Like the last time you did this, you lost 3% of your population. Like the last time you did this, 1/3 of men under 50 in South Carolina died. Like you absolutely don't want to do this. So like there really has to be a better way, you know, than civil war. God, I mean, God willing, there is.
Yeah. So again, we say that this is not like 1863 all over again. And in fact, the next thing you say is that it kind of tailing off of this one. You say that it's we don't see it because we don't want to see it. You wrote,
Yeah,
in a sense, the crisis has already arrived. Only the inciting incidents are pending. In America's first Civil War, Buchanan's State of the Union address preceded the war itself by 5 months, but his declaration that secession was unlawful, but that it couldn't constitutionally do anything about it, marked the moment when America split and the war became inevitable. From then on, the country operated two separate political systems, two legal systems. The country cracked before it divided. So, in that sense, you say
yeah.
the crisis has already arrived. What do you mean by that? And where are the cracks today?
Well, for instance, I mean, I'll take two that I think are sort of more parallel or more analogous to the first Civil War. So if you're a woman and you're driving through the United States, you're able to get pregnant. Your rights and duties as a citizen change not just state by state, but sometimes county by county. That's what preceded the Civil War in many ways, is that there were just essentially two legal systems, or there were actually a series of fractious legal systems. Um, the other thing is that the tolerance for violence is getting pretty extreme. And I mean, it has taken on a new dimension, but like well farther advanced than what I was describing in the book. When you have someone like Luigi Mangione, who, killed a totally innocent man in broad daylight in New York City, and 40% of Americans under 30 approve of his actions, that's very frightening. And also, of course, like the release of the January 6th riders, which essentially is saying like political violence is fine as long as your side wins. And I mean, one line that I think about more and more right now is what Cardinal Richelieu said in the French Revolution, which is treason is just a matter of dates. And I think America has entered a period right now where treason is a matter of your timing.
And so, what do the cracks look like today that you see?
Well, I mean, the acceptance of violence. I mean, but also like the most recent poll says that 90% of Americans believe their political system is completely broken. So, I mean, right?
90%. I didn't see that one.
Well, yeah, it was in the New York Times. It was actually interesting because they asked them, "Do you think it broke recently?" And it was like 20%. And Democrats and Republicans were the same. It was like Republicans thought that it was been broken forever. Democrats thought it had been broken more recently, but they both were at 90%. Right. So if you have a political system where the people genuinely don't feel it's legitimate, I mean, you are in a broken political system. So I don't think and then rising capacities for violence, right? Like I think we've seen a bit of that just right after the election, but I think we can only expect more of that. I mean, it has been rising for a long time,
Yeah.
so I don't know why it would diminish now.
Right. Yeah. Certainly don't see any evidence of that.
Yeah,
So, so
I
let's
don't see any evidence of decline. I mean,
So I want to get into what a civil war would look like in the modern era as opposed to 1863, where it was North and South.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, I think on that previous screen we just showed, you said it's just waiting for the inciting events, and that's the
Yeah.
bulk of your book, where it has dispatches where you project this is what it could be. And before I even get into the specific one I want to talk about, could you explain what that means by you're not predicting the future, but you're showing some samples of what could be the inciting incident?
Yeah, I mean, nobody knows the future, and anyone who tells you they know the future is selling you something. But on the other hand, these models are hugely powerful, and they are pointing a direction for the country and for the world that is pretty unignorable. So in this book, the models are the stars, right? Like that's to show that is the point of the book. But I created sort of fictional scenarios to kind of put meat on the bones of what that would look like. In one of them, I imagined a county, a sheriff deciding to resist federal authority, and sort of going into battle against the federal, like the federal forces. That was based pretty closely on battle plans that an interview with the man who drew up the battle plans for full scale operation in the homeland. And so that, I think, is, that's not like it would say like I'm imagining it, but it's actually what the counterinsurgency and the counterterrorism community of the U.S. military, how they imagine it. And they imagine it sort of as in between, like something in between the troubles in Ireland and worst case scenario like Syria, right? Like it's not, yellow versus, sorry, gray versus blue going to war. It's much more chaos and like trying to control chaos. And of course, every attempt that you make to control chaos leads to more chaos. And the classic, loop of insurgency and counterinsurgency, which, we've spent 70 years learning the lessons of. So that is the very particular vision that I had of the next Civil War. I mean, to me, like the Civil War movie, where it's like California and Texas going against somebody in Washington with Air Force and so on. That's not even remotely in the cards to me. What is just terrorism and asymmetrical warfare and insurgencies of various kinds.
And in fact, on that sense there, and I think you addressed this at some point during the book, if I recall. The secessionist movements that have been building a little bit of momentum in Texas and in California, and maybe one or two other states or so. But you don't think that that's something, at least not in the near term, that could happen?
Well, the interesting thing is, I never imagined in a million years that there would be a serious challenge to the 14th Amendment, right? Like the 14th Amendment is extremely clear. And the 14th Amendment is essentially, after the Civil War, they say you're an American first, and everything that the states decide to do has to come through you being an American, right? And if you're born in America, you're an American. Um, if that were seriously challenged, which it seems to do, then the path to secession would be much more open. But I mean, as it stands, like people think of secession as like you start a movement and then it splits. It's incredibly complicated to do. It's a vast legal process. If there were secessionist movements, like if you were Texas, you wouldn't be America anymore, right? Like you wouldn't be the
Right.
world's 800-pound gorilla. You'd be another country. You'd be like Canada, right? Like except not as established, right? Like and so that the power that you would have to really secede, people don't really understand. Like how difficult it is to do that and the legal mechanisms that are required to do that. On the other hand, I fully expect those movements to grow in power over the next 4 years. There's very little doubt in my mind that they will.
Yeah, which just I think just keeps the cracks growing, as you're talking about here.
Oh yeah,
To,
yeah,
to
yeah.
me, I think that of the dispatches, the one that alarms me the most is the one about a presidential assassination. And
Hmm.
Gary, if you can put that's the call out there about the president up. First of all, you're talking about the meaning of the president, why this is so important. You say the hyperpartisan environment means that any American president will be a symbol loaded with a double meaning. She or he will be an icon of American leadership for half the country and an icon of oppression and illegitimacy for the other half. Symbolism matters. Countries live and die by symbols. No American president of either party now or for the foreseeable future can be an icon of unity, only of division. Now, you probably wrote that
Jeez.
somewhere in 2019, 2018. Now then,
Yeah.
how do you view that?
Well, I mean, I'm glad you're showing the bits I got right. It's very nice of you. You know what I mean? Um, yeah, I mean, I think that, well, could that be any truer than now? Like, I mean, I just think the presidency as a force for unification. I mean, we're talking in 2025, right? Where it has absolutely been a force of division and going to continue to be a force of division for the next 4 years at a minimum. But then whoever is elected next will equally be a force of division. And so that actually creates extreme vulnerabilities in America, like not just in terms of like making civil war more likely, it actually creates scenarios where other countries can take advantage. Right? It is a terrible weakness to have when you don't have the symbol that's supposed to, a pluribus unum is now, you know just literally a crack breaking the country apart, and with the breaking apart force, right? I mean, there's no talk of reconciliation, or like, I mean, it's all destroy, destroy, destroy. So it's yeah, this symbolism is now in effect just a permanent divisiveness. And that real like, it's things like this where it's like people were trying to pull back. You could say this is an exaggeration, but no one's trying to pull back. They just want it. They want to go into this crevasse, and that's you can't stop people from doing that when that's what they want to do.
Yeah, and I would argue that you'd have been right no matter how this election came out,
It,
because if it had
a
been,
million, yeah, of course, yeah.
yeah,
Well, I
something
mean, nobody
similar, then
thought. I mean, but half the country thought Biden wasn't elected this
well,
year,
right, right, yeah.
right? I
So it
mean,
only started then.
yeah. Yeah, and it started in 2016. I mean, and what really
Yeah,
started in 20 like in the birtherism around Obama, the invalidation of that. So I mean, that points to 2008 again. But then the invalidation of the presidency as a political technique. It just like these are the kind of bargains that people make for short-term political gain that just suck away the capacity of the country to exist, right? And I mean, I was at the 2016, like, not my president. I was like, well, whose president is he then? Right? Like, there's 600,000 people on the street screaming, not my president. Well, he is your president. But I don't think there's going to be a presidency maybe ever again where everyone's united. I mean, maybe
well,
I'm
and,
wrong.
and that really raises the reason why this concerns me of all the dispatches that you wrote, because many of the others, like I think it was the flooding in New York, or the issue over the bridge you were talking about there,
Yeah,
those could be sparks that could catch fire and go other places. But this one is one that would immediately affect everyone, from shore to shore in the
yeah.
country here. And in the book you describe, I wonder if you can, in a second, if you can describe what you talked about, how an assassination would split people just in category and theory. But then this one already in this current environment, I think I sent you an email a couple of days ago that there was a piece
Yeah.
on Alex Jones where he showed on social media some woman that's obviously wanted Harris to win, and she was lamenting that Trump had won, and said, oh, we should chop off his head or something like that. And Alex Jones came back on and said, if that happens, there's almost like he had been playing a part in your book, that it would almost been a more plausible scenario. But I think that if anything were to happen to Trump, and we've already had at least two we know of assassination attempts while he was a
Yeah.
candidate or in between. If that happens now, I think that the tinder could be really, really bad about blowing up. How do you view the risk today of that happening?
Well, I mean, there are a couple different ways of looking at that question. I mean, one is the tolerance for violence is growing, right? And it's growing on everyone. So if you point to the Mangione case, where this is an assassination of a guy who, if you were to create a list of the top 10,000 people responsible for the debacle of U.S. healthcare, he would not be on that list. He is not the enemy of anyone. He is an innocent man with two children and now a widowed wife. Um, and there's widespread, I mean, not just widespread support. New Yorker writers are going on television and saying they approve, right? Not randos on social media, right? So people are certainly openly talking about how much they would love to see Trump assassinated. Like that is absolutely no question that that is a totally normal conversation to have in certain cities in the United States. On the other hand, the left really has a very diminished capacity for violence, and historically, they don't do it very well. Right. Like if you look at like when I was doing my research, now this was 2020, like 2021, like right wing violence was about 54% of of political violence, if I've got it right. Um, and the left was only 4%, and in the middle there was various Muslim groups and so on, like but so there was a big difference between the right wing and left wing violence. That said, it's entirely possible that we could be transforming into that.
Well, don't I
The
remember
other
that your dispatch was that the guy who did the assassination of then a female president, and your
Yeah,
assessment was actually motivated because of things he had heard, not that he was put up to it by somebody else. So there could be a lone wolf kind of person who's listened to someone like that woman I talked about there, and then go act on their own. But whatever it comes from, the act
yeah.
itself I just seem like it would be a match on gasoline.
Yeah, but frankly, it could be anything at this point. Like that, you're right that that's one thing, but like, what happens when the consumer price index goes up? We just had a run on the AI markets today. So like, what if that sparks a financial crash? And there's no like, the Tinder is lit. Like, but you wouldn't need a presidential assassination to push this situation right over the edge, right? Like, a presidential assassination would for sure do it, but there's actually like dozens and dozens of much less serious situations that could absolutely cause widespread outbreaks of violence, right? Another plague or not. Like, I mean, the administration is now basically doing away with the administrative state. The grown-ups are not in the room anymore, so when you're trying to deal with these situations, there won't really be anyone there to deal with them. It will be people sort of trying to figure them out on the street. And it's, I mean, just to be clear, this is an incredibly dangerous moment for the United States. And I'm not saying that a left-wing assassination of the president wouldn't start a huge conflagration, but it could actually be like a dozen things.
Oh
And
wow.
and I mean, yeah. Oh, I mean, I think if there's more inflation, right? Like if there's more inflation, if the consumer price index goes over a certain point, in the immediate future, I mean, there's going to be very serious consequences from that. But also, I think when you're thinking about political violence, like the January 6th, the people who've been released from January 6th and pardoned from January 6th, I mean, those groups, the right wing groups, are not ideologically coherent, right? Like they are not going to
Mhm.
be loyal to anyone. They are in fact constantly shifting their politics. They're constantly shifting their intellectual basis, and they've now been proven to be that their violence is acceptable. And actually, like the threat to Trump from those groups, and the threat to his party from the divisions that are within it that are already violent, is actually another very serious possibility.
Hadn't
Like
thought of that.
the Musk Bannon split, I mean, that's classic, right? That could go a lot of different ways, and all of them violent.
Wow, I actually hadn't thought about that
Yeah,
part there at all. And I don't know if this is the perfect tail end or not, but it may be even more complex than I thought. One of the other things in this whole book that really jumped out at me, and now that I've kind of gotten that lens to put on my face, it's like I see it all over the place. And that is not that there is no more United States of America. There are two Americas. And the way you wrote that is, Americans hate each other, that they don't speak to each other. No one occupies the middle ground anymore. Everyone's separated into their one side or the other, the one party or the other, no matter what they may claim. According to Pew Research, and this is another thing that really highlighted it, 58% of Republicans view Democrats very unfavorably, up to 21% from 21% in 94, and 55% of Democrats view Republicans very unfavorably, up from 17. There are 41% of Democrats and 45% of Republicans who now believe the opposing party is a threat to the nation's well-being. And that was alarming to me because as a military man, when we're looking at potential external enemies, we say, all right, who is the most lethal, the threat to the country, and now then they're the enemy, and so we're constantly thinking of ways to defend against them or how we would attack them if we need to. And I can't think that something similar isn't happening internally on those same mindsets.
I mean, it is. I mean, I've been around both sides. I mean, there is, these groups don't marry each other. They don't eat with each other. I mean, the craziest research, and remember, this is research I was doing in 2019, right? Like think about those stats, what they must be now, right? Like this is exacerbating, like, every day, right? One of the craziest stats I saw was that someone did phone data on Thanksgiving dinners, right? And Thanksgiving dinners where people came from red states to blue states or blue states to red states, they spent an hour and a half less with their families than if they came from, this is there is evidence, and again, this is from 2019, that hiring regimes are more prejudiced against people from other parties than they are from other races. And I mean
Oh, wow.
massively,
Really?
massively. Oh yeah, yeah. No, no. I mean, I think I mean, it was the number was crazy. Like it was, and I mean, so let's just put that in perspective. The Democrat Republican gap is much more intense than racial animosity in the United States.
That's saying a lot.
You know what I mean? Like that when you put it in that point of view, it's like, okay, well, what are we doing here? Like, what do we like? There needs to be some way to get out of this situation because because it's only getting worse, right? Like that's the thing that's so troubling. Is like I kind of wish this book had, like, those quotes you read were all embarrassing. Like they were all like, "Can you believe you wrote that? Like how stupid you must feel." Like, but it's only gotten more true, right? And that's upsetting.
That the reason why that part is upsetting to me is the next part I want to go to is what experts say and what the people believe. Because if you're getting into all of these kinds of issues that you say and all the stats and whatnot, the fact is if people are thinking more about each other as enemies, if they're seeing each other more as opponents, if there are two Americas, then you see that in foreign policy, a panel of national security experts assess the chances of a civil war over the next 10 to 15 years. The answers range from 5 to 95%. That's a big spread, but that's the consensus stood at 35%, which is also huge. Then on the
Right.
personal level, 2019 poll from Georgetown asked Americans how close the edge of a civil war their country was on a scale of 1 to 100. Almost the aggregate of their answers was 67. That was much more alarming to me. So almost
Yep.
exactly 2/3 of the country. If you believe the other side is an enemy and you believe that it's inevitable that we're going to fight, then it seems that continues to erode the threshold from entering into this kind of a conflict.
Oh, and I mean, think of the larger consequences. What if there's an attack? What if, like, where to what if other countries who wish you ill want to do you harm? Who at this point in history could your country even recognize that an external enemy was worse than their internal enemy? Right? I mean, like there is no sense of, I mean, like George Washington's farewell address is, I mean, that is a incredibly remarkable document if you've ever read it, because it predicts this moment just to astonishing
Yeah,
clarity.
I have. I've
I
actually
mean, it's just
cited that before. I know exactly what you're talking about.
it's incredible. I mean, it's a true. I mean, I guess it makes sense. He knew the country he was building, and he knew its weaknesses, and he knew what could happen to it. But yeah, like this is like if you're fighting each other, and you regard each other as the enemy, like what's gonna happen? Like one thing that we know happens in politics and in history is events. Like unpredictable things happen externally. It's not all in your control. And so what happens when events start to happen? I mean, it's very it's truly that's started to worry me more and more. Like the internal dissension in the United States and its paralysis, um, makes it it makes it so vulnerable.
Well, so let me ask you this. from where you were in 2019 when you started writing this book, and even from
Yeah.
2016 when you first became aware that there might be an issue that needs to be researched. So, where are you today in your level of concern?
What's out of a scale of?
Well, from where you were in 2019.
Oh, well, I mean, in 2018, when it was a magazine piece that turned into this book, my editor said, "You don't believe this, do you?" And I was like, "No, no, I do believe it." And then I remember when I sold it to my publisher, Simon and Schuster, and I remember he was on Sixth Avenue in New York, and I like crossed Fox News is right there, and I crossed right in front of Fox News, and there was a fist fight between some protesters outside Fox News, and I had to literally jump out of the way of somebody being beaten up. And I
Oh
handed in
Lord.
my manuscript, and I handed in my manuscript, and he said, "But you don't actually believe this is going to happen." And I was like, "I just left a fist fight
You
on
just
the
did
street
outside.
outside your office. Like, I think there's something to be worried about here." I think like what's happened is the models have been right. Like they're clarifying, and like certainly, when I wrote this book, I don't give dates or anything like that because it's not, as I said, it's not a work of futurism. It's not really projection. But the date I had in mind was 2040 because that's the date when America becomes a majority minority country and so on. Obviously, it's accelerating a lot faster than that. And the experts did tell me it's a complex cascading system, which means that it's got multiple factors pouring into it. I mean, we haven't really even processed what's going to happen with all these people in California. Those disasters have huge ancillary effects on countries and communities. Like people get spread in huge waves, and there's crime facts about it. I mean, it's a that hasn't even been dealt with. And that, so, and there just keeps being those things one after the other, these threat multipliers. So I would say I'm much more worried than I was in 2019, that's for sure.
And since speaking of that, the California situation there, one
Yeah.
of the things that struck me and really made me think of your book almost right away, there was a number of experts, I think one of which was on Joe Rogan podcast or so a few years back, said all the conditions are in place to have a super mega fire that could, cause all kinds of damage. And the guy was apparently saying at the time, all we see the fundamentals and the factors, all we're waiting for is just the wrong set of circumstances. Do you get the sense that we're in this case where it's like a really dangerous thing that even possibly a minor spark could blow up into a big wave right now?
Yeah. I mean, why do you think the insurance companies turned off their insurance for those places? Because they can read the data, right? And they can read, they know what, it's not that they know what's going to happen, but they know what the odds are, right? And I mean, if you want to be really like the most frightening thing in this book, which is the chapter on New York, hasn't happened yet, but it's the most stable, it's the most reliable information in the book, right? I mean, that is based on the data of a reinsurer. So that's someone who insures insurance companies. Literally trillion-dollar bets are made on his information and his models, and he doesn't think New York's going to survive. And New York, like Los Angeles, very important city, New York is the center of the financial universe. 88% of foreign currency trades go through New York. If New York falls, a true chunk of the world order will fall with it, right? So, yeah, like, I mean, that was the point of the book, is that the dry tinder is there. How it's going to, play out, no one knows. But
So,
if
so
you read the data, you can
as
tell.
we kind of close out here, I wonder if you can kind of help people get a sense of it. So whether, because you said a minute ago, there could be any of a dozen, maybe even plural dozens of potential sparks that could cause something. But once something happens, what does it look like on the ground? What does it manifest in say Lubbock, Texas, out in the middle of nowhere, or in somewhere in the middle of Alabama or so? For just regular people, how would this manifest on the ground if the spark catches on fire?
Well, I mean, when I was trying to establish that, I was talking to a lot of veterans. I was talking to a lot of soldiers who'd come from Civil War situations. I mean, essentially, what it is terrible violence, like horrific levels of violence that are incredibly devastating to communities. And then the attempt to clamp down that violence to give a space for some kind of peace. And that means things like Alaska gates between counties, having to have your papers when you go from state to state. It means incredibly restrictions on your life, which frankly, like Americans, I mean, can you imagine? trying to get Americans to carry papers. I mean, who could be tasked with such a task, right? Um, and I mean, though that was the kind of impression I got from the counterinsurgency experts, and that's how I envisioned it, right? So clamping down on movement and society, in a country that literally can't even, restrict guns. Meanwhile, violence blowing over the edges, and that is what it looks like in a lot of places where it hasn't happened before, and then suddenly it happens.
And in some, we've had little glimpses of that so far, like during a lot of the pandemic times, and there was some of the issues with George Floyd, and we had a
Yep.
lot of violence going on in some cities, but was they were able to contain it, and it didn't blow up then. But I guess if you get a situation where, especially if whatever it is, what's the economic situation, and it's not located or isolated to a geographic location, but it's something that affects all over the place, then I guess the chances and the risk of is that accurate?
Well, I mean, imagine 2019 and January 6th, but you don't have a functioning police force anymore because Kash Patel's in charge of the FBI, and no one, like, the inspector generals have all just been the inspectors general have all just been fired. So you're going to have this administrative state extremely hampered, and that's what Trump was elected to do. So imagine those events where you really don't have any kind of grown-ups trying to impose order. Instead, you have, roving counter gangs with each other. I mean, that's one vision of it. There's, but like, yeah, it's also, even in those incidents, you had things like police forces going off uniform and acting in effect as small militias. But yeah, like the chaos of 2019 and 2020, except without, large structure orders to actually trying to contain it. And so it just, instead of containing it, just goes out and out and out. I mean, that's what chaos looks like.
So given the current, we were now all of 8 days
I,
into the Trump
could I just
administration.
add? Could I just
Sure.
add that those projections are just mine. Like, that's not from the expert class that I talked to. The stuff in the book is much more. That's just me thinking of what it would look like. The
Yeah.
stuff in the book is much more based on, serious military analyses and, like, people who have actual experience dealing with war and dealing with
Well, yeah,
civil
and I
conflict and
have.
so
I've
on.
got 4 combat deployments of my own, and I've
Right?
trained a
Yeah.
lot in counterinsurgency. So, Peter Mansour, you quoted, and I know his
Yeah.
work well. So
Right.
one of the reasons I was so alarmed by this, because I can see how some of this would work out.
Right.
But before I let you go, let me ask you this. So we're 8 days into the Trump administration already,
Yeah.
because I've got lots of both conservative and liberal friends, and my liberal friends are like terrified about what's going on. They're fearful that everything is the next Hitler. It's now a fascist state that's coming into play or
Yeah.
whatever. All the conservative friends are thinking, well, it's about time we're finally getting some law and order, et cetera. Giving
Right.
more credence to there are two Americas, because they're seeing radically different.
Yeah.
Especially as we get into not even too long from now, the midterms, where then the Democrats are going to try to recover their losses and try to take the House or the Senate away
Yeah.
from the Republicans, et cetera. And so they're going to get back into that whole fear mongering thing, et cetera. Is there anything on the horizon that you see that there could be a countervailing force, that somebody could say, take this action that could tamp things down? Or do you think, and I mean, I'm putting you in a hard position here, that we're basically on a build up until some trigger finally blows up?
Well, I mean, this, you put me on a spot, so I'm going to give you a double answer that's going to be unsatisfying, right? So one thing is, I haven't seen any evidence of um, attempts to slow it down, right? And I think people who think that the Trump administration is law and order, you're going to be very disappointed in that, right? Like, this is not the actions of somebody who is going to contain violence, right? This is someone who's going to spread violence. But one thing about the American political system, because it is so linked to entertainment, because it's basically like a reality television president, and like, one thing is that
Straight up. Yeah.
uh, the one rule of pop culture. I was a pop culture columnist at Esquire for 8 years, and there's only one rule of pop culture, and that is that everything that's hot gets cold, and everything that's cold gets hot. Right? Hemlines go up, hemlines go down. Indie rock is in, indie rock is out. And then back in. Right? And today is probably the most popular that Donald Trump is ever going to be for the rest of history, right? And so and that's not,
Fascinating.
that doesn't really depend on what he does, right? That doesn't, like, that's just the way that this operates, right? And so there, America, you know, one of my favorite ideas in the book is the idea of a reverse pendulum. Like, because it seems to me so clearly what's happened. Like, the left goes crazy left, and then this makes right-wing people go crazy right, until you get everyone's worst self. You get and that's the world we live in. The left is absurd and utterly ridiculous in all of the manifestations that we know about, and all of the social justice, nonsense that we've been dealing with. The right has gone crazy too, right? And they drive each other crazy by going back and forth. So, and that is how American politics has worked since 2008. Left, right, left, right. Ever more extreme versions of both things, right? So if that pattern continues, there'll be an even more extreme left than Trump is right. Which
Oh, that's a
sounds to
scary
me,
thought.
yeah. I mean, it sounds to me like very, very, very terrible. But it's all like the options are poor. There's no, like, this, as you know, 90% of Americans know their political system is broken, right? So it's not like, you can't really get good outcomes when you have a bad system. It doesn't matter what people you put into. It doesn't matter how good the men and women you put into her. If you have bad systems,
Yeah.
you get bad outcomes.
And I know a lot of history, and
Yeah,
until you get the system itself breaks down and has to be rebuilt, I don't know how you get it fixed.
I mean, there are America was the exception, right? Like, America was the self-righting ship, right? It was the system that didn't break down, that just kept. It had the Civil War, and then it righted itself, and then it kept righting itself. And that phase is past, I think.
It faces past, and I guess we'll have to see what happens next. But at least the contours are there. It just is
Yeah.
up to us to what happens next. And I sure appreciate you coming on and providing such clarity to this, because this is a really an illuminating, if somewhat disconcerting show today. Appreciate it, though.
Real pleasure to talk with you.
Thanks a lot. And thank you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't done it on the way out. We always appreciate you helping, and we're going to continue to be unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth, no matter what it is, even if it's something that's very alarming like this one here, because you deserve to know the truth. Thank you very much. We'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.